God, the question could be asked. We must first acknowledge our sins and then be willing to submit to God's mercy. It is only through a humbling of ourselves that we will be allowed to walk with God. God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Let us pray. In keeping with Paul's instructions, in 2 Timothy 2:1-2, I urge that supplication, prayers, intercession, and thanksgiving be made for everyone, for kings and all who are in high positions, so that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life in all godliness and dignity. We present our supplications to you this morning, Heavenly Father, that you will grant to your leaders wisdom beyond their years in dealing with our annual budget and formulating plans to cause our nation to prosper again. To grant our people everywhere victory over the snares of the devil, so that our nation may once again become a peaceful and loving people, so that crimes of every description, including murders, to cease throughout our islands and our capital. Wilt thou not revive us again, that thy people may rejoice in thee? We thank you for sending refreshing from the presence, gracious God, across the length and breadth of our nation. Bring us back to God, our Savior, and stop being displeased with us. Will you be angry with us forever? Will your anger never cease? Make us strong again, and we, your people, will praise you. Show us your constant love, O Lord, and give us your saving help. Father, we pray for the spiritual and physical protection of our elected and appointed leaders and their families, that you will keep them from the snares of the devil. All in all, Father, when we consider where you brought us from and where we are today, receive now our thanksgiving and praise, which we offer unto you with gratitude and with grateful hearts. We speak peace and love and unity among all our people, whichever political persuasion they may choose to continue to support. Most important, Father, we thank you for sending your Son, our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, to die on the cross to save us from our sins. And he who taught us to pray, saying, and let us pray together, Our Father, which art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come. Thy will be done. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. Lead us not in temptation, deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. May you have a wonderful day.
Dr. Dwayne Sands, Marvin Dames, Frankie Campbell, Dionisio Diaguila, Michael Pintard, Darren Penfield, Romuald Ferrara, Lanisha Rose, Granville Rose, Alfred Johnson, Philip Davis, Vaughn Miller, Takesha Parker Edstrom, Hiram Lewis, Carlton Boleg, James Audrey, Travis Robinson, Adrian Gibson, Donald Sanders, Frederick McAlpine, Hank Johnson, Mark Hume, Michael Folk, Miriam Reckley Emmanuel, Reese Shipman, Reuben Ramming, Ricky Mackey, Shannon Dawn Cartwright, Chanel Ferguson, Glennis Hannah Martin, Tyso Forbes, Chester Cooper.
Good morning, honorable members. Good morning to you in the gallery. Today, I will take this opportunity to bring brief remarks sent by rules of procedure. The chair, who is also a representative of the people, is unable to participate directly in the debates. I will take this opportunity to bring just a brief statement. Today, as we commence the 2017-2018 budget debate, we are 7 days into the 2017 hurricane season. Natural disasters such as hurricanes transcend political boundaries and can leave behind lots of destruction, particularly when warnings are not heeded. Moreover, global warming, stimulated by the anthropogenic activities steadily impacting the atmosphere and is steadily deteriorating the environment in which we live. These factors have led to increase in both frequency and intensity of major hurricanes. As a former chief meteorologist and a hurricane forecaster, the obvious synopsis of my observational analysis of the Bahamas' fiscal circumstances suggests a prognosis that the natural phenomenon called the tropical cyclone or hurricane will become synonymous with budgetary deficits outcomes. Whether there is sufficient evidence to support reasonable justification or postulated outcomes, the greater questions underpinning the budget debate, I suggest, should be, did we heed the warnings of our budgetary constraints, and what prudent measures are we as representatives of the people prepared to implement in the people's best interests in the aftermath of cyclonic-like downgrades to upgrade and recover from our critical current financial status. As a precautionary pruning of the trees leading into a hurricane season, which can eliminate the threat of uprooted and fallen trees and thereby protect the trees, avoid damage to power lines and our homes, keep the environment healthy and the surrounding atmosphere rich, so will financial discipline, accountability, and transparency safeguard and protect our precarious and vulnerable debt-to-GDP ratio. On the other hand, fiscal recklessness or lack of prudence will create a financial environment similar to neglected, fallen, and destroyed trees, which only add to the damage of a hurricane will inflict on residents, their property, and financial prosperity. For the upcoming Atlantic hurricane season, forecasters have predicted that there's a 45% chance of above normal season, a 35% chance of a near normal season, and only a 20% chance of a below normal season. And while I make no predictions of the likely category with which our fiscal deficit will fall, the Bahamas budget deficit, notwithstanding my expectation, is that the Parliament, this Parliament, should and will become synonymous with halting the spiraling deficit trajectory and with returning the Bahamas to a below normal path as we make our way towards a balanced budget. And I conclude with this statement that as it relates to my constituents in the Nassau Village constituency, while they will not have a voice from their representative in Parliament, I implore each member of this honorable House, as you go through your deliberations, to be cognizant of the fact that Nassau Village is a real constituency. The people have real needs, and as you go through the various categories of the budget, just keep us in mind. Thank you. As we go through, now we go through the order of business for the day. And having dispensed already with the first 4 items, we go to the laying of documents by ministers. Are there any documents to be laid by ministers? None. Statements and communication by ministers. Communications by the clerk. Messages from the Governor General. Messages from the Senate. Motions for leave of absence and leave to resign. Receipt and new writs. Presentation of petitions. Presentation of reports of committees. Adoptions of reports of committees. First reading of bills. Second reading and committal of bills. The chair recognizes the member for East Grand Bahama.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I rise on behalf of the wonderful people of East Grand Bahama to move for the second reading and committal of the following bill. A bill for an act for the appropriation of diverse sums of money for and towards the defraying of the expenses of the government of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas on revenue account for the fiscal year beginning July 1, 2017 and ending June 30th, 2018. Mr. Speaker, as is the usual format for the budget debate, we will debate a compendium of bills comprising the budget, but I am moving just the first bill, the Appropriation Revenue Account Expense for 2017-18 Act 2017. This will facilitate the debate on the entire budget. Mr. Speaker, 1 week ago today, I presented the government's communication for 2017 and 18 fiscal year. As the very first communication of our government during our current mandate, it marks a new and promising beginning, not only for government, but more importantly, for all Bahamians. For they have spoken loudly and clearly that the affairs of state and the management of our economy could not continue as they have had for the past 5 years. Accordingly, they have entrusted our government with a clear mandate to implement its vision for a brighter future as laid out in our 2017 manifesto. As was reaffirmed in the budget communication, and though we have only been in office for a matter of weeks, we have taken up the mantle and begun to act on the transformational socio-economic growth agenda that will guide us over the next 5 years. Throughout, we will be fully transparent and accountable to the people, and we will provide the good governance that they rightfully deserve. Today, I want to lead off the debate on the budget, and in doing so, I will focus my remarks on a certain number of critical messages in the communication. Specifically, I want to expand on 1, the need for immediate funding for the 2016-2017 2017 obligations, the so-called overhang. 2, our economic and jobs growth strategy. 3, the fiscal challenges to be addressed. And 4, our plan of action for public sector reform and fiscal redress. Mr. Speaker, this funding for the 2016-17 budget gap was an urgent and necessary transaction and reflects the imprudent management of the fiscal affairs of the country by the previous administration. The $400 million figure is directly attributed to the non-investment rating of the government and an acceleration of expenditure in the last 4 months prior to the last election. The $400 million figure is directly attributable to the non-investment rating of the government and an acceleration of expenditure in the last 4 months prior to the last general election.
The chair recognizes the member for Cat Island, San Salvador.
I wish the member from East Grand Bahamas to explain or to elucidate how does that accord with the statement made in his communication in respect to the 400 million, where he specifically, because he's either misleading the House and the general public by that statement made, or he has to tell us how that accords and is consistent with what he says in his communication last week. The point of order is that he's misleading the House, because what he's saying now does not accord with what he said last week at page 41 of his budget, when he says it is more likely directly the $400 million deficit. Yeah, I could read. Yeah, right, was due to a combination of factors. One, a shortfall in revenue of $216 million. Right, the capital expenditure falling, all of it is pegged to the act of God, Hurricane Matthew. No, that's what you said. No, I said the act of God. Okay, fine. I'll read what he said, Mr. Speaker. I'll read what he says. I'll read what he says. I'll read what he says.
Honorable member, what page are you on?
Page 42.
Page 42?
Page 42. Recurrent revenues were also reduced through the effects of the exigencies order implemented by predecessors as a means of providing relief to those impacted by the hurricane. In combination, these factors resulted in shortfall in recurrent revenue collections to the tune of $216 million, to a level of $1,960 million versus the 200. He's saying, Mr. Speaker, he made a statement that is contradictory to these remarks. And I'm asking, no, finance, but I'm saying, I am referring to what he is saying, Mr. Speaker. He says one thing in the communication, he's now saying something different. That's why I asked him to repeat it. And I asked him then to accord what he's now saying, what he said last week. He spoke to the shortfall in revenue as a result of Hurricane Matthew. He spoke to the need, the rebuilding efforts and repair for public infrastructure.
Honorable member.
That amounted to $55 million. And he spoke to that from page 41 to 43 of his communication.
Honorable member, I think if you would give the member the opportunity to elaborate as he goes, perhaps you will get your answers.
Mr. Speaker, if the member would be patient, he might understand where I'm coming from. I don't, no, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, there's no point of order here. Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm on my feet.
Honourable member.
I'm on my feet, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member is still on his feet. He is not yielded.
No.
Honourable member.
No.
Can you take your seat?
No. Mr. Speaker, I carry on. Mr. Speaker, upon the downgrade by Standard & Poor's, the government was immediately faced with collateral calls or posting with respect to the derivative transactions previously entered into by the government. The total value of the collateral calls was in excess of $150 million. And while this does not represent an expenditure, it does represent a use of cash, which has to be funded by revenues. The Ministry of Finance was partially successful in negotiating temporary waivers, but the obligation has not gone away. The government is now required to provide a minimum of $70 million by the first week of July to meet this collateral call. In the event of any further negative rating actions, this amount will increase, and given the long tenor of these transactions, exiting at this time would represent expenditure of over $120 million. And I am advised that that is not a recommended path at this time. Mr. Speaker, in addition, as of 30th May, the total outstanding payments of the Treasury was $161 million. This represents payments approved but awaiting funding. In addition, commitments, meaning promises to pay for goods and services once they're delivered, total $131 million. This figure, Mr. Speaker, is not exhaustive, as we are aware of further unrecorded commitments. While the government is not insolvent, it is clear that it has a liquidity challenge, and as a result, employees and vendors have had to wait an inordinate time for payments. And I want to apologize to many of our civil servants who have had to suffer the challenge of their deductions not being paid over to banks and other agencies, their salary deductions not being paid over on a timely manner, which has caused them some discomfort. And that is one of the things that is so hilarious, if I might put it that way, about the leader of the opposition's statement a few weeks ago about the payment for police officers' overtime. Says that if he can pay that, it means we got all kind of cash in the account. But he doesn't. But what he didn't understand is what we had to juggle in order to make that happen. But Mr. Speaker, there's no point of order. He said it. Mr. Speaker, the situation is allowed to continue. The situation, if
Honourable member, what is your point of order?
Order is that the member puts in my mouth that I said that funds were there to be paid, right? And indicating that that was not so, because statements were also made that the cupboard was bare. But I just heard the same member says that the government is not insolvent. Just said it.
I mean, you know, honestly, we can be here all day if he's going to make these irrelevant points.
What he said
right?
is the cupboard.
I'm very clear with what I said.
We looked at some of the
Mr. Speaker, and anyway, you know, the statement was made earlier that you're not a finance man. Leave that. Mr. Speaker, the situation, if allowed to continue unaddressed, would severely hamper our efforts to improve the government's fiscal position and would not be in keeping with our commitment to improve the operations of the public finances through transparency and accountability. The numbers speak for themselves, and unfortunately, the Emergency Borrowing Authority was the only prudent thing this administration could do to protect the financial reputation of the Bahamas. And I am grateful to the side opposite, knowing full well these fiscal realities accrued by them, accepted that position last week. Mr. Speaker, I must state unequivocally that the unabated spending and indifference to the fiscal realities of this country, which created the need for the emergency funding, has stopped, as this government has a clear mandate for change. Turning to the economic and jobs growth strategy, I will begin with the core tenets of our economic and jobs growth strategy. In doing so, I would note that the communication reiterated the reality that the Bahamian economy is very heavily dependent on developments in the global environment, especially in the U.S., as our most important trading partner. Other small, very open regional economies, such as ours, face a similar reality. As such, historical data reveal that the evolution of our economy has traditionally been closely aligned with that of the American economy over the years. Indeed, in general, the annual growth rates of our economy and that in the U.S. tend to move up and down together in tandem, in lockstep fashion. However, while this is the general pattern, I would note that there has been important negative divergence from that pattern in the past, during which the Bahamian economy growth significantly underperformed that in the United States. Interestingly, and perhaps not by coincidence, these undesirable episodes have occurred during the tenure of the party opposite. For instance, in the early 1990s, we witnessed a very sharp negative divergence in growth rates. This was a time of great distress in our nation, with very real prospects of total social and economic collapse. As a result, while the United States economy did register only negligible growth in 1991, our domestic economy actually shrank by 4.2%. The following year, the U.S. rebounded to roughly 4% positive real growth, but our own economy continued to contract, this time to the tune of 3.8%. It was fortunately at this time that our party, the Free National Movement, was given its first mandate to govern, and it was successful in implementing a comprehensive economic and social reconstruction plan. This plan was based on a market-driven economy, powered by the private sector and entrepreneurship, and supported by responsible, prudent, transparent, and accountable governance. The results of this strategy was prompt and significant. By 1993, our economy had returned to modest real growth, and by 1994, it was growing at over 3%. In the subsequent 4 years, it recorded growth rates between 4% to 5%, which culminated in real growth of 7.1% in 1999. That, in fact, had been the strongest annual growth rate in at least the last 35 years, and was one of the very rare episodes when real growth in the Bahamas outstripped that in the United States. Mr. Speaker, developments on the economic front during this period naturally translated directly to the state of the labor market. With the very sharp contraction in economic activity in the early 1990s, our rate of unemployment reached a level of almost 15% in 1992. The F&M government's success in reinvigorating economic growth in the subsequent period resulted in a sharp reduction in the rate of unemployment to a low of 6.9% in 2001. That, as well, is a buoyant labor market situation that unfortunately has not been matched since. Mr. Speaker, there is a clear lesson for the future here that is not lost on our government. Stronger growth of the economy can indeed generate adequate new jobs to accommodate a growing labor force and also reduce the incidence of unemployment. And government most definitely can and must be proactive agents of change to facilitate private sector investments and growth and prepare its citizens for the emerging opportunities. Our manifesto is justifiably inspired by the success of our predecessors. Mr. Speaker, our most recent experience with the lax and shoddy governance of the party opposite occurred recently over the past 5 years. And as history would have suggested, the Bahamian economy paid a price. Over 4 straight years, our economy either stagnated or shrank. The numbers tell the tale. Real growth was 0% in 2013, a negative 0.5% in 2014, a negative 1.7% in 2015, and 0% again in 2016. In contrast, it is striking to note that the United States economy actually expanded every year over the same period, with positive annual growth rates ranging from 1.6% to 2.6%. Again, another episode of a large negative divergence in growth rates between the Bahamas and the United States that on the evidence was self-inflicted by poor leadership and misguided management. Pardon me? Zero. As I tried to highlight forcefully last week, it is estimated that on the basis of this pitiful performance, the size of our economy will actually be smaller in 2017 than it was in 2012. Again, the numbers speak for themselves. Real GDP in 2012 was estimated at $7,965,000,000. This year is expected to be on the order of $7,904,000,000.
Honourable member, what is the point of order?
The point of order is I asked the member what was the growth rate.
Give me a break, man. You've been here too, long time, much longer than me.
Right? I asked the member what the growth rate was in 2016, and he, yes, I see it. And then he repeated that it was what, 0.6%. Well, at page 39 of his communication last week, he indicated that the IMF projects the economy to have expanded by 1.4% this year. But that's, yes. And
Honourable member.
Yeah, that's true.
What is the point of order?
The point of order is that I'm asking him to explain this projection of 1.4 and his statement now of 0%. And 2016, yes, this year, 2016. And I also...
Honourable member.
No, 2017.
Honourable member. The chair is speaking, honourable member.
Right.
What I would recommend, honourable member, is that this matter obviously appears to be one of factual information and one of projected information. The discrepancy that you are raising, it's not, it's like apples and oranges. You have a projected figure versus a factual figure.
That's what I understand.
And what I would recommend is that you address this matter when you respond.
No, Mr. Speaker, no, I am unable to do so, and I tell you why. I accept your distinction that what is in the communication is projected. What he said was factual. So perhaps he may be able to explain the distinction between what was projected and what facts he relies upon to say that it was zero. This year it will be 0%. I regard that the fiscal year will not be finished until June, till the 30th of June of this year. And that is where the challenge rises. So I agree with you that you said, yes, one is factual, and yes, the other is projected. Now, the fiscal year doesn't finish. It's not completed until the 30th of June. And so it is a question then, how could he be so factual when the year is not completed? And if he is factual, then he could perhaps assist us in providing the facts upon which he has arrived at the conclusion that the growth rate for this year is 0.
Thank you. Honorable member for East Grand Bahamas.
And might I point out to him
Come on, man.
that the schedule to your communication suggests even a more robust growth than what is projected by the IMF, both for this year and next year.
Thank you, honorable member.
Thank you,
Yes,
Speaker.
Chair recognizes
I'm reminded by my
Bahamas.
colleague that's because we won the election. but Mr. Speaker, the member will have an opportunity to speak.
Yes.
He can't give my contribution for me. Right? I'm going to give my contribution, Mr. Speaker. Now, Mr. Speaker, he answered his own question.
Honorable member.
He answered his own question. Because for one thing, Mr. Speaker,
honorable member.
He's not recognized, Mr. Speaker.
You're not rising at a point of order now. Please take your seat. The honorable member for Grand Bahama, can you continue?
You got clients waiting in your office, man. You go make some money.
But Mr. Speaker, if the member would listen to what he's saying and what he said, he would have answered his own question. And I'm not going to give him the answer. But if he listened to what he said, play back what he said, he would have answered his own question. But anyway, Mr. Speaker, it is worthwhile to pursue a moment and reflect on this data, for it is simply amazing. How is it possible that an economy with a growing labor force could actually shrink in size over a 5-year period when the economy of our dominant trading partner was expanding at modest, though decent, positive rates? It is little wonder, then, that we face such a chronically high rate of national unemployment, as well as an even more distressing problem of youth unemployment in this country. Our economy is simply being unable to generate adequate new employment opportunities to both reduce our rate of unemployment and take up new entrants into the workforce. Mr. Speaker, I provided this brief historical overview not as a mean-spirited attempt to demean the performance of our colleagues on the other side, but rather to illustrate the strong and lasting tradition of our side in addressing the dire economic and social challenges that have confronted our nation. We have successfully either transformed deep domestic recessions with elevated levels of unemployment in a period of strong growth and falling unemployment, or striven proactively to mitigate the effects of recessionary forces and supported recovery and unemployment to the extent feasible when the external environment has turned unfavorable. Simply put, we've done it before and we'll do it again. On coming to office, we face similar challenges today. But it is evident that the world has changed significantly over the past decades, and as such, the policy agenda that we have proposed in our manifesto is different from previous approaches in that it is attuned to the realities of the 21st century. What has most definitely not changed from our party's long track record is our dedication to the values that have sustained us through good times and trying times, namely selflessness, integrity, objectivity, accountability, openness, honesty, and leadership. These qualities are absolutely essential for good governance and the discipline necessary for this critical recovery. Mr. Speaker, it has been estimated in some circles that the annual rate of real economic growth on the order of 5% or more will be required if we are to absorb the new labor force entrants and significantly reduce the rate of unemployment. In light of the historical record over the past 2 decades, and given the modest prospects for the world and U.S. economies going forward, this is a tall order indeed. In the circumstances, what is called for is a bold vision and agenda for stronger growth and prosperity in the future that is premised on the firm belief that we as a nation can do much better than the status quo. Our manifesto contains just such a bold transformational socioeconomic growth agenda, geared to the realities of the 21st century. Through our plan, we will seek to create a more open, productive, and competitive society and economy, as this is essential to our ability to compete successfully in today's global economy, gain valuable market share, and thereby boost our economic performance above and beyond the current static expectations of some economic forecasts. In practical terms, this means creating a knowledge-based society, promoting Bahamian ownership, entrepreneurship, investment, and creativity in tandem with strategic foreign direct investment, investing in new infrastructure and upgrading existing infrastructure throughout the country in collaboration with public-private partnerships where appropriate, investing in public sector reform, as efficient public services are essential to facilitating doing business and maximizing economic growth, and getting the nation's public finances in order through the elimination of the deficit and returning the burden of government debt to lower and more sustainable levels. And no, it will not happen overnight, as some have been speaking about lately, as if we can wave a magic wand and all will be right. We've inherited a mess, and it will take some time to sort it out. Mr. Speaker, I will now expand on some of the more core policy thrusts. I begin with our key priority of creating a knowledge-based society. To that end, we believe that it is imperative that we engage in a complete reform of our educational system, since progressive and sustainable economic development rests entirely upon the proper education and training of our people in the modern era. That is critical to innovation, creativity, and entrepreneurship, and underpins productivity growth and competitiveness. Our reform plans for the education system are multifaceted, and among many planned initiatives include the further incorporation of technology in the classroom, beginning at preschool levels. The Minister of Education, Science and Technology will expand further on our plans when he speaks. The budget communication was unequivocal that we as a nation can and must do better than the status quo if we are to bolster economic growth and generate the employment opportunities that are needed for our expanding workforce. To that end, we believe that it is vital that we move beyond an undue emphasis on foreign investment to propel economic activity across the nation. While we do acknowledge an important role for such investments, if they are legitimately strategic in nature, and I stress, strategic in nature, we are firmly committed to unleashing the potential and creativity of homegrown entrepreneurs as catalysts of innovation, investment, and stronger economic growth, particularly in non-traditional industries. In order to support and promote increased Bahamian entrepreneurship and ownership in our economy, and especially small and medium-sized businesses, my government has laid out in its manifesto a detailed array of measures that it will pursue during this mandate. These include the introduction of the much-awaited Small and Medium Enterprise Development Agency in order to consolidate the services and incentives of all relevant agencies, support for entrepreneurship and enterprise centers, providing a $5 million capital infusion to the Venture Capital Fund, establishment of a one-stop shop incorporating relevant government agencies and services as a means of easing the burden and cost of doing business in this country, encouragement of the commercial banks to establish small business units staffed with professionals attuned to the particular needs of small and medium enterprises, including mentorship and guidance, further strengthening of the Fresh Start and Jump Start programs established by the previous F&M administration, and making available incentives and inducements that are in line with those offered to foreign investors in the same sectors of the economy. Mr. Speaker, I'm amazed by the millions we have given away in cash incentives to such foreign investments. No, I didn't know. We will also strive to revitalize the Grand Bahama economy through initiatives that are geared to accelerating, broadening, and sustaining its economic development. The budget communications announced that we would repeal and replace the disastrous Grand Bahama Port Area Investment Incentives Act 2016 that I have personally labeled a job-killing bill. Our objective is to ensure that all licensees receive equal treatment under the law with the greatest opportunity for success, unencumbered by red tape and unreasonable cost to operate. Among other measures proposed in our manifesto, we will, in addition to the measures set out in the communication, relocate the Bahamas Maritime Authority to Grand Bahama as a means of establishing it as the maritime capital of the country, and we will leverage the container port and shipyard infrastructure to attract new investment into that sector. We will further develop BTVI and the University of the Bahamas to more effectively support the island's industrial and hospitality requirements, promote Grand Bahama as an ecotourism sanctuary, and East Grand Bahama is a gem that has yet to be discovered. By capitalizing on the airport infrastructure, we will seek to develop the aviation sector, as well as attract overnight courier services. Utilize Crown land in East and West Grand Bahama to create a hydro farm and a mariculture facility to produce crops and seafood for export. And Mr. Prime Minister, this is a particular sensitive issue for Grand Bahamians, residents of East Grand Bahama in particular, because a lot of them have gotten approval for Crown land, but cannot, for whatever reason, get the title deed to that Crown land, and thus they have been hampered in developing their farms and there are other enterprises that can help to sustain and grow the economy in East Grand Bahama. And eliminate all preferential treatment that hinders the growth of business on that island. Mr. Speaker, our inner city communities in New Providence have long been economically and socially depressed areas and have been neglected by government for far too long. Our government will, during this mandate, therefore move to reinvigorate and transform these so-called over-the-hill communities through incentives for entrepreneurship, investors, and especially small and medium-sized businesses that will spur the business growth and job creation within these communities. We will support the construction of business premises and new or refurbished owner-occupied homes. We will establish community centers with activities that strengthen family and social cohesion for the youth and the elderly. And we will ensure the provision of potable water, sewer, and sanitation services in line with those available to other citizens elsewhere in New Providence. So Bain and Brownstown and Centerville be coming for them outside toilets. And if South Andrews would behave, he might get his time too. He's been crying a long time. Mr. Speaker, I now want to turn to a discussion of the current fiscal position that we confront at the start of our mandate. While we did expect matters to be worse than we had been led to believe by the previous administration, we have now discovered, as I explained last week, that the public finances of the nation are in far, far worse shape than we had imagined. Indeed, we face an immediate cash flow shortage that caused many payables and salary deductions to be delayed as we robbed Peter to pay Paul, so to speak. The GFS deficit in the current fiscal year is now estimated at $500 million, fully 5 times more than the $100 million forecast that was presented only 12 months ago. In presenting this data last week, I made a legitimate effort to objectively explain that an important portion of the very large $400 million slippage reflected the impact of Hurricane Matthew. And I, in fact, went to some length to explain, again, objectively, the various ways the hurricane adversely affected the fiscal situation in 2016-17, including its impact on the economy and revenues, as well as its effects on government expenditure. But I was equally clear that the 2016 fiscal story did not end there. Indeed, I explained that we've discovered since coming to office that the previous administration had entered into many eye-opening new spending commitments on the eve of the last election, contradicting their own stated policy that no such last-minute commitments should ever be allowed to occur. It was revealed in the budget communications that those commitments total in excess of $300 million, and quite possibly much more, as we are learning from one day to the next, new commitments that have been made. And you know, Mr. Speaker, it is interesting, and I'm sure at some point we will talk about it, the commitments and contracts that were signed between the 8th and the 9th of May. Millions of dollars in commitments. Mr. Speaker, it is therefore deceptive to assert that the huge deficit overrun this fiscal year is solely attributable to the effects of Hurricane Matthew. It is evident that the blatant fiscal recklessness of the other side in the run-up to the election was a major contributing factor. As the new incoming government, it is thus left to us, once again, to clean up the mess that was left by the previous administration. To which end, we have had to obtain parliamentary approval for an emergency borrowing resolution in the amount of $400 million that will allow us to clear up the backlog of payments owing and those unfunded commitments. And again, you know, Mr. Speaker, it's so disingenuous of the side opposite. Because I saw some statements in the newspapers talking about $722 million and how this government just came into office and they're borrowing $722 million. It is so disingenuous, Mr. Speaker, because when they look back at the 8th and the 9th, they will have to explain to the Bahamian people how they entered those contracts and why they entered those contracts for works as well as for services and employment and extension of contracts for people who are on contracts, who naturally should have ended. They're going to have to explain that. And in explaining that, they will give the answer to why this $400 million was necessary. Mr. Speaker, the sad reality is that this egregious fiscal mismanagement was not a one-time event. The record clearly documents the reality that our predecessors lacked fiscal discipline throughout their 5-year mandate. Mr. Speaker, let us briefly look at the cold, hard facts. As was illustrated in the budget communication, over their 5-year term in office, the side opposite ran up GFS deficits totaling over $2.2 billion. And they hoisted the burden of government direct debt by virtually 50%, from 48% of GDP in 2011-2012 to 71.5% of GDP in the current fiscal year. Beyond this year, the fiscal structure that our predecessors have left to us is projected to result in a GFS deficit of some $323 million in 2017-18, as well as primary deficits of $31 million. In turn, that will bring the debt burden to an all-time high of 72.7% of GDP in the current fiscal year. So when they talk about us borrowing $722 million, they are indicting themselves, Mr. Speaker, because that is their spending. That is their commitments that they have already spent in 2016-17 and which they have committed the current government for 17-18. That's them. And there's no point them saying that we can adjust, because these are commitments that have signed, the government of the Bahamas has signed. And so you can't cancel just like that. We are reviewing some of them, but there are a lot of them that you can't, because they're penalties. You have to pay them out. And so we don't have the flexibility. And so when they criticize about borrowing $722 million, they need to go look in the mirror. Look in the mirror. Mr. Speaker, I want to stress again, as was done in the communication, that this is a so-called policy-neutral projection, meaning we have not inserted our own policy goals and initiatives in this current budget. Just not enough time to do that. Although we've looked and see how we can adjust. And as I've said in the communication, that as we go along, we will be reviewing and we will be adjusting as we go forward. And when we come back in the midterm, hopefully we'll have a picture to paint and a story to tell about how we've been able to pull back on some of the budgeted expenditure. The fiscal affairs of the nation are in a serious state, and it is imperative that we act promptly to do something about it. Doing so will both create a stable macroeconomic environment that supports more buoyant economic growth and job creation, and assure the sustainable financing of our transformational growth agenda. I'll return to those matters shortly. Mr. Speaker, prior to doing so, I want to provide additional details on the previous administration's fiscal track record during their recently concluded mandate. Bahamians deserve to know not only what went wrong over the past 5 years, but they also deserve an explanation of how and why that was allowed to occur. Again, the facts speak for themselves. The massive GFS deficit that has been run up since 2012 reflects the action of a government that did not understand, or did not appear to understand, nor appreciate the very basic fundamental principles of sound fiscal management. Year after year, they boosted recurrent expenditure well beyond the ability of the Bahamian public to pay for that spending through various taxes that it submits to the public purse. In other words, year after year, the previous government incurred large deficits in its recurrent fiscal balance. That is the difference between the recurrent expenditure and recurrent revenue. These deficits ranged from $195 million in 2014-15 to a high of $498 million in the current fiscal year. Mr. Speaker, that simply put is sheer insanity. Let us compare this situation to that of a typical Bahamian household that works hard to earn sufficient income to house and feed its family. Such a household may well seek to borrow funds with which to procure a home for its family, and that is financially justifiable, as the home will provide a steady and ongoing stream of services to the family. The family will then be in a position to service that loan and gradually pay it from its future earnings. However, should that family find itself suddenly in need to repeatedly borrow money just to pay for the weekly grocery bills and other current expenditures, that would be a dire situation, and without correction could well lead to financial insolvency. This admittedly is a simple analogy, but I have related it to stress the point that the previous administration, through its lax financial management, had essentially engaged in substantial borrowing during its term in office merely to pay for the so-called groceries, recurrent expenditures, the day-to-day cost of running government. Mr. Speaker, I would be remiss in relaying this information on their track record. if I fail to mention that all the while, spending like drunken sailors, they did lip service to the need for fiscal consolidation. Indeed, they published as early as 2012-2013 mid-year budget statements, in their 2012-13 mid-year budget statement, a detailed plan of action to reduce recurrent and capital expenditure and enhance recurrent revenue as a means of eliminating the GFS deficit within their mandate and getting the nation to a lower burden of government debt. And with the wave of a wand, their plan was projected to result in a GFS surplus of $80 million in 2016 and 17 fiscal year. And you know, I remember that so very clearly, because sitting right over there, myself and the then member for St. Anne's looked at each other and said, what fairy tale land do these people live in? La La Land. Because you cannot continue to increase recurrent expenditure, hoping that you will collect more taxes from the Bahamian people in order to make the books balance. It just didn't make sense. And true to form, Mr. Speaker, yes, honorable members, you did hear that right. A surplus of $80 million was projected for 2016-2017. 5 years later, however, we now know that that surplus has vanished into thin air and has been transformed into an actual deficit of $500 million. Now, to be fair and objective, the previous administration did succeed in achieving the goal of enhancing the revenue yield of the tax system to more appropriate levels, more in line with the needs of a modern Bahamas and into the range of other nations in the region. The reforms that they continued in the key areas of customs, real property tax, and business license did go some way in contributing to the rise in the revenue yields. But I would stress that these reform efforts have not been complete and will need to be pursued in the period ahead. And I just pause to note that we understand the difficulty that business license tax, as it is currently structured, is disadvantageous to business. It is a jobs killer too, because it is unfair in how it's calculated. It actually drives some profitable businesses into loss positions because the tax is calculated on the gross turnover, irrespective of the cost to operate that business. And on small margin businesses, gas stations, other food stores, others who have a thin profit margin, that business license tax can actually cause a otherwise profitable business to lose money and to eventually sink and close. I don't think that is the goal of any government, to force a business that is employing Bahamians into closure as a result of its taxes and its insatiable need for tax revenue. And so we're going to come back to that business license issue at some point during this mandate. Of course, the key policy measures for revenue enhancement has been the introduction of the value-added tax in 2015. This is a tax that has been mulled by various governments in this country for at least the past 15 years. Based on international experience, it is a tax that is an efficient instrument for generating the revenue streams needed to finance government. True to form, the Bahamian VAT has indeed produced, as expected, with over $1.1 billion collected over its first 2 years. The VAT is projected to generate some $665 million in additional revenues in the 2017-18 fiscal year. Mr. Speaker, I would submit that Bahamians did accept the VAT, perhaps grudgingly, as most of us did, but with the full expectation that its proceeds would be utilized to reduce the debt load that so burdens and hamstrings the government. This is another failed promise of the last administration. But this current F&M administration will follow through on that commitment in the next fiscal year, not this fiscal year, the next fiscal year, by allocating a percentage of the value-added tax revenue directly to reducing the debt. In other words, paying back some of these loans that we have outstanding. Unfortunately, as I said, the previous administration seems to see matters totally different. Indeed, the data in respect of the government's recurrent expenditure and revenue during the past 5 years of their mandate reveal that they willingly chose, to a significant extent, use the increased recurrent revenue to boost recurrent spending. They used the VAT, in other words, not to reduce the deficit and the national debt, but to increase spending on programs, in a lot of instances, that were clearly not well thought out because they lost money. Through this revenue reform program, including the introduction of VAT, they managed to significantly increase the annual level of recurrent revenue from $1.4 billion in 2011-12 to $1.96 billion in the current fiscal year. That represents an increase of $530 million. However, over the same period, they managed to increase recurrent expenditure from a level of $1.6 billion in 2011-12, the year prior to their mandate, to a level of $2.5 billion in 2016-17, for an increase in recurrent expenditure of $826 million a year. Let that sink in and marinate. We are paying more taxes, which is intended to pay down the debt, but instead we have increased expenditure of $826 million. Now, how could the debt come down with those kind of out-of-control spending? Mr. Speaker, and again, Mr. Speaker, the member for Cat Island and Rumkey and Ragged Island says, how's the debt come down? Oh, sorry, he says, how's it defaulted? Well, Mr. Speaker, if, and I actually talk about it a little bit, if you go out every year to borrow money to pay off a loan to prevent default, what do you call that? You know, you didn't default. You didn't default. But you sure didn't lower the debt burden, because all you did is swap an old loan for a new loan. And in the current dispensation, if we had to do that, the cost of that new loan is going to be higher than the old loan. So, no, we didn't default. You're right, thank God for that. We still have the ability to borrow. Thank God for that. But one thing is for sure. If the last administration had stayed in office, this country would have been in trouble on the path that they were going. You can't keep borrowing to pay your loans. It's a vicious cycle, and will end up in total disaster. And as you say, putting tremendous burden on our children and grandchildren. Now, admittedly, Mr. Speaker, some $245 million of this higher spending was due to higher debt redemption requirements. That's what we're talking about, refinancing debt. And interest payments are higher this year than in 2011-12 by some $107 million. That's what I'm talking about. Every time you refinance, interest costs going up. This suggests that over the course of its mandate, the previous government increased the level of operating spending, excluding interest and debt repayments, by $474 million. As such, fully 89% of the revenue increase during their term was swallowed up by increases in spending over which they had direct control. Let me say that again. As such, fully 89% of the revenue increase during their term was swallowed up by increases in spending over which they had direct control. And included in that, Mr. Speaker, is over $20 million spent with just one foreign consulting firm. One. $20 million. One consulting firm. And I leave it to the Bahamian people to determine whether we got value for money. Mr. Speaker, as was clearly demonstrated in the budget communication, our government must, as a first priority, act decisively to put order in the public finances of the nation. Our aim is to eliminate the GFS deficit as promptly as is feasible and practical. And to that end, we will strive to identify in-year fiscal savings in 2017-18 that will transform the projected primary deficit of $31 million into, hopefully, a surplus. In other words, that's what I spoke about earlier, that as we go along in the new budget year, we will look for savings to hopefully halt some of this bleeding that we have had over the last 5 years. Having now seen the gravity of the fiscal position that has been left to us by our predecessors, we fully appreciate that fiscal redress is necessary to restore and sustain confidence in the Bahamas, strengthen our international credit rating, and thereby set the stage for the full implementation of our policy agenda. Indeed, if our aggressive plan of action is to be sustained and successful, it must, without question, be underpinned by a solid fiscal foundation. To be quite blunt, the government's fiscal position is untenable and simply not up to the task of modern governance. We cannot go on and on mortgaging the future of our children to finance the day-to-day running of government today. We must place government in a position to be able to meet the many and varied demands placed on it in a modern democratic society, doubly so in an archipelagic country such as ours. After the past 5 years of government spending beyond its means and borrowing funds that it did not have to pay for that spending, the time has come for decisive fiscal action. Any further delay in doing so would only make the inevitable, necessary corrective measures more drastic and painful. One need only look at what has happened in a number of countries around the globe to appreciate just how painful delayed fiscal adjustments can be in both economic and social terms. Turning around the fiscal position and placing it on a solid, sustainable basis will underpin the achievement of the other elements of the government's plan of action for stronger growth, more jobs, and further social progress. If we were to postpone determined fiscal action, the gap between spending and revenue on the recurrent account would lead to an ongoing and pronounced rise in the debt burden. The debt to GDP ratio would rapidly escalate to yet higher and more damaging levels. Very soon the government will find itself in a very difficult position of having no choice but to drastically cut spending and raise taxes, as other nations have had to do. It is therefore clearly preferable and imperative that we act now with a plan of our choosing to redress the unsustainable fiscal imbalance and rising debt burden. That is critical for both the sake of fiscal prudence and to allow the government to play its rightful role in society in effective and financially secure fashion. Mr. Speaker, I stressed in the budget communication that our government is firmly committed to working diligently in the months ahead to improve on the near-term fiscal situation and medium-term prospects that have been left to us. To that end, we will take action on several fronts, in which I would now like to expand. A review and assessment of expenditure programs. Mr. Speaker, based on the review of fiscal developments over the past 5 years that I presented, it is evident that the government expenditure in this country is at the crux of our fiscal problem. Recurrent revenue in 2017-18 is projected at some 23% of GDP, and that is 5.4%. So that is a 5.4% improvement from the levels of 17.6% in GDP in 2011-12. For its part, recurrent expenditure in the next fiscal year is forecasted at 28.6% of GDP, up fully 8.6 percentage points from 2011-2012. As such, over the period, revenue has gone up by 5.4%, but recurrent spending has increased by 8.6%. Looking at it another way, in 2011-12, the negative gap between recurrent expenditure and revenue, the so-called recurrent balance, amounted to 2.4 percentage points of GDP. In the coming year, the gap is forecasted at 5.6% of GDP. Clearly unsustainable. Mr. Speaker, in layman's parlance, not only did the previous government borrow large sums to pay the grocery bill, but engaged in further excessive spending during its term to the point that it had to borrow even more to cover the cost of everyday spending. Through its actions and inactions, it placed on our nation's public finances in an impending vicious cycle of deficits and growing debt and interest payments that could begin to feed on itself automatically to disastrous levels in the absence of the determined resolve to arrest it. That's what I talk about, that vicious cycle. When you start borrowing to pay debt. When you take one Visa card to pay your MasterCard. And then when that one comes, you get the American Express to pay the Visa, the MasterCard. And you keep going around and around. Well, yeah, exactly, when you hit SunCard. I got to give our Bahamian card its due. The SunCard could afford it. They could be the last one. But it's clearly not sustainable. So we have to break the cycle. SunCard powered by MasterCard. You gotta love it. I'm giving advertising now. Somebody got to pay. I think it's a royalty due to government. But Mr. Speaker, it again points out why we have to break this borrowing cycle. And unfortunately, we do not have the time in this current cycle, in this current budget that we'll be presenting, in order to critically review some of the excesses that we have in the budget. But as I said before, it is our intention to start a very determined and aggressive review of all of the programs and expenditures that the government has engaged in and has been committed to engage in for the upcoming year. We believe there are savings to be had. In light of the improvements in the revenue yield of our tax system in recent years, it is evident that more taxes are not the principal answers to correct the fiscal mess that we inherited. While ongoing reform efforts must continue to improve the administration of the tax system and ensure that taxes due are rightfully paid, I believe the primary focus of our efforts must be placed on containing the growth of recurrent expenditure. To that end, as was announced in the communication, we will undertake over the next few months an in-depth review of government expenditure programs to determine where and how service effectiveness and efficiencies can be enhanced and savings and reallocations can be secured. This review will include the much talked about forensic audit and forensic accounting reviews where necessary to determine validity of these charges. Mr. Speaker, I would submit that such a review of spending is long overdue. Many of the programs and services that are delivered by the government have been in existence for a very long time, and as might be expected, have come to be seen as simply something that the government does, year after year. However, change and transformation abound around us, whether in respect of global trading patterns or technological innovations, and the notion that business as usual, like building sidewalks to nowhere, where people don't even walk on abandoned roads, but that is acceptable. It's no longer acceptable. It can no longer be tolerated. Indeed, our government's vision of a socio-economic transformational growth agenda for the Bahamas is founded on this view.
We would yield, you know.
The review of government expenditure that we envision must be comprehensive and all-encompassing if it is to be successful, and more importantly, accepted with broad consensus.
I understand his family, so I may go on my way.
Excluding certain areas would certainly be counterproductive and would likely doom the exercise. However, while acknowledging this reality, the fact of the matter is that the gravity of the current fiscal situation requires prompt action and early results. Accordingly, we will launch our review of programs and services in a phased way, focusing initially on a select few of the major areas of spending where appreciable financial savings relative to the status quo going forward can be expected to be identified. Other areas of activity and spending will be brought into the fold as we move ahead. The overarching goal of this exercise is to ensure that the government's restrained level of fiscal resources is directed to the highest priority requirements and to those areas where the government is best placed to deliver programs and services. We seek to secure the most efficient and effective ways of delivering our programs and services. Such reviews and assessments will be guided by a core number of criteria, namely, does the program or service continue to serve a public interest? Is there a legitimate and necessary role for the government in this area? Can any parts of the programs and services be transferred to the private sector or to the voluntary sector? How can the delivery of programs and services be improved? To the extent that there is a private rather than societal benefit from the program or service, to what extent can cost recovery and user fees be utilized to finance these programs and services? Is the resultant package of programs and services consistent with the restrained fiscal levels? As may be seen, the program review exercise will, through the application of these criteria, essentially be an ongoing process that loops back on itself if sufficient financial savings have not been identified. And so, in other words, we will do a first brush. And then to the extent that we have not gotten the savings that we desire or that are necessary, we'll go back through it again, cutting our cloth as necessary to ensure that we meet our fiscal objectives. I understand the Prime Minister and the member for Yamacraw, sorry, Elizabeth, they're both surgeons, they tell me, so they know how to cut. I myself, I'm an accountant. Mr. Speaker, the member for Engliston asked if we're going to be firing people. And I will just answer her this way. I'm not going to even say that.
No, don't answer.
What I'm going to say is that we will not place on the backs of the Bahamian people cost that they cannot bear for political expediency. As we announced in the speech from the throne, our government will also... Are you recognized?
I was saying, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I was just, I thank the member for yielding. I was just asking a question from my seat because it's a question people want an answer to. And it is, as you go through this brush back and forth, cutting your cloth, is it likely to involve termination of people in the public service? That's what I was asking. You've answered it differently. You're saying, you said something that was much more aggressive in a response. I'm just wondering whether people are facing loss of revenue or income as a result of this exercise. That's the only question I was asking.
Mr. Speaker, I've answered the question, but I will say this again. Persons were hired just before the election, May 10th. In fact, May 9th. People were hired by the previous administration. Hundreds of them. In Acklands today, it's 41 people, Mr. Speaker, in Acklands, who are calling, trying to find out how they're going to get paid and when they're going to get paid. 41, Mr. Speaker. May 9th. And Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, what is egregious about that, Mr. Speaker, is that the previous administration gave these people the impression that they were going to be long-term employees. Mr. Speaker, the contract, though, for those people is 3 months. And so, Mr. Speaker, I don't know what they were going to do when if they were, heaven forbid, successful. But they've got these people on a 3-month contract, and when the 3 months is up, this government is going to have to make a decision. But they want to stand up and claim victimization. Mr. Speaker, once again, the government of the Bahamas will not put more on the Bahamian people than the revenue that we generate can bear. Simple. We cannot continue to carry as if there is fat and plenty. So no, we are not terminating any civil servants. That's not the plan. But we are going to insist on efficiency. We are going to insist on redeployment of some resources. But we are not in the business, unlike y'all or the side opposite, who, when they came to office, wiped out everybody in urban renewal, didn't care about them, who, in the lunch program, people who were providing lunch to the schools, gone like that, boop, who couldn't, it didn't even give them notice enough to put their affairs in order, Mr. Speaker. And, you know, the egregious part of that, as social services will find out if they haven't already, they weren't paying the new people. And so those kids weren't even getting lunch in the last couple of months. Because the vendors, their vendors, you know, not the vendors that they met, vendors that they terminated people to put in place, they weren't paying. They weren't paying them. And so they stopped providing lunch to some of these schools. And so those children who depended upon it, and there are many of them, Mr. Speaker, they come to school looking for that breakfast or that lunch, because it might be the only meal they have. But because of their fiscal mismanagement and don't care, my word, they allowed them children to suffer. And you know what? The results of May 10th is in part a payback for that. As we announced in the speech from the throne, our government will also work to strengthen the accountability and transparency of the fiscal operations of the government in the Ministry of Finance. As a key component of this plan, we will vigorously pursue the further implementation and completion of the IDB-funded public financial management project as soon as possible. Limited quality, production, and use of information are undermining the government's capacity to determine priority actions. Cumbersome processes and inconsistent practice in public finance management and procurement has reduced capabilities to align resources accordingly. The information presently available is of limited quality, difficult to assess, and consequently not widely used for evidence-based policy and decision-making. More importantly, it also undermines the development of a coherent narrative of government actions. And I've said in here several times that while we are starting to understand the magnitude of the commitments that have been made by this government, we have still yet, and the system does not seem to be able to tell us in any central agency or spot what the full amount of the commitments are. And so every day we get somebody popping up that they are owed this, or they have a contract for that. It's just, I mean, it is absolutely stunning to me as a business person that there is not some place where all agencies must report and it's tracked, whether it's even just tracked on an Excel spreadsheet, what the government has committed itself to and what it owes. The treasurer is on a cash basis. And so, for large part, she only knows what she knows, what's put to her. That can't work. And this all goes back to the move towards a government accrual accounting. It's necessary because we have to know. We have to know if we're going to be fiscally responsible and be able to make the kind of adjustments that a modern Bahamas, a modern governing structure needs to bring this whole fiscal house back in order. We just have to know. But currently, we don't have that full capability, Mr. Speaker. And like I say, everywhere you turn, there's something else that pops up. Tourism is an interesting one. There are all kinds of commitments out there. and if you ask people at the Ministry of Finance, they can tell you some they can't tell you. Some, apparently somebody's keeping their drawer. It's an amazing thing. Mr. Speaker, to address these issues, the government has requested and secured financing from the Inter-American Development Bank, IDB, for support in two main areas. One, strengthening of public performance monitoring, and two, the modernization of public financial management and procurement. In the area of, I said continuing. Yeah, I know. I understand. A lot of information. I appreciate that. In the area of public performance monitoring, the availability of high quality and relevant data is critical, and therefore a solid statistical system is central. Some of the areas where immediate attention is required relates to the institutional capacity of the Department of Statistics. Improvements are needed in internal coordination, technical resources, data dissemination, and the legal and normative environment. The current Statistics Act dates back to 1973. Obviously needs to be updated. And we're committed to updating the whole suite of legislation as we go forward to reflect the current and modern times we live in this country. Additionally, the outdated IT systems have hindered effort to improve data production, create awareness of the importance of the Department of Statistics, and the need to use statistics in the country for evidence-based policy making. In the area of public financial management, the government faces the challenge of increasing efficiency in the allocation and use of resources and in producing actionable data for decision making. The Ministry of Finance has a set of financial management systems that are outdated and have reached their capacity for expansion. The main function is basic cash management and payment. That's what I talked about. Under the terms of reference of this project, the overall objective is to increase efficiency in the use of public resources. The specific objective are to enhance the capacity to produce and provide access to quality information for evidence-based policy making, and to improve the ability to better allocate and track public funds. The program is expected to have a positive impact on the performance of the Bahamas public sector in line with the following expected results: better capacity to monitor performance in the implementation of public policies in key ministries, improved quality of statistical production, increased access to official statistics, and a more effective use of statistics for policy making in line with regional and international standards. More efficient public financial management with an integrated financial management information system, fully implemented and functional in line with ministries and public entities, and a public procurement system with fair and transparent rules generating savings and values for ministries and relevant entities. Mr. Speaker, I now turn to the issue of the many state-owned enterprises in this country. As was highlighted in the budget communication, there are over 25 such entities that rely on subvention from the government. 25 such agencies that rely on subvention from the government. These are so-called quasi-government agencies and corporations. In 2017-18, such financial support will amount to $429 million. Annually. This year. $429 million. Fully $79 million more than last year. Why? Primarily because of national health insurance. You remember last couple months ago, the former Minister of Health, in an interview, said, yes, we're going to launch national health insurance, and we have, I think at the time it was 400 and something people signed up. It eventually grew to 1,200 or something. Signed up for national health insurance. But I don't know how we're going to pay for it. That was his statement. $79 million we got to come up with for national health insurance. And it ain't over yet, Mr. Speaker. It's not over yet. This is the disastrous path that we've been on, Mr. Speaker. Will we put in place these brilliant, bright programs and create all of this goodwill and good feeling? Oh yeah, the government's taking care of us. But we don't bother to work out the details. How are you going to pay for it? Is there a better way? Can we somehow wring out more effective services out of the system that we have? This is how you get into trouble. This is how you get to $400-500 million deficits. Yep. Mr. Speaker, the largest subvention by far relates to the Public Hospitals Authority, which will receive over $213.8 million next fiscal year. Fully 50% of total government subventions. Minister of Health, you got to help me. I need some of that money back. Please, sir. Next on the list are the new National Health Insurance Authority, which is $48 million. That we know of. Like I say, still counting. Still going. The University of the Bahamas, with $34.5 million. The Water and Sewage Corporation, with $30 million. The new Bahamas Civil Aviation Authority, with $17.1 million. And everybody's favorite, Bahamas Air, with $14.9 million, if He's not here. If he's successful in an intervention. Otherwise, those new ATRs can cost us. The aircraft. Yeah. They can cost us to blow a hole again. Potentially another $35 million, Mr. Speaker, because the principal payment is due. You've been paying and delaying the principal. You've only been paying the interest. But now that principal is coming home. You got to pay. And so we have to make a decision about what we're going to do about that. You see, again, you can only roll the ball up the hill so far. It starts coming back the other way. And so, yeah, you all been delaying everything, hoping that you'll win the election. But boy, the day come.
That gamble didn't work.
The day coming. So it's a reality.
$40 million a year.
$40 million a year projected for Bahamas Air. If we don't fix something, if we don't correct something.
Just for Bahamas Air?
That's not the prevention.
Taken, we can do something about it though. We can fix it. Taken together. No, the Aguilar. Taken together, these 6 entities account for total subventions of $358 million, or 83% of aggregated subventions. Mr. Speaker, this only tells a small part of the story. There are other...
Chair recognizes the member for
Yes, Speaker. Yeah, I think the member is... I mean, I think he's not cognizant of on the issue of aviation, and the whole issue. I don't think there is a subvention yet. It is still being paid. It's the Department of Civil Aviation, and an authority was formed, and the way the Ministry of Finance crafted it, it is being paid from the consolidated fund as if there was still Department of Civil Aviation. So it's really a shifting of what you're paying now, any old how, because of the Department of Civil Aviation. It's now an authority. It's nothing new. So it's not a new subvention. So I just want to clarify that so the impression is not given that we got this quasi-agency we're paying the subvention to. It's a new formulated entity, and it's moved the funding for Department of Civil Aviation into the authority, the expenses in that area.
So I take the minister's point. It doesn't change the fact that we still are going to give the Civil Aviation authorities, because there are several of them, $17 million. That's the point that I'm making, Mr. Speaker. But as I said, this only tells a small part of the story. There are other entities which have underperformed and not provided any benefit or static benefit to the state. For example, BEC and its operating company BPL have not been in a position to provide dividends to the government for over 20 years. And you know, BEC used to be one of the most profitable entities that the government owned. It is a shame what has happened to BEC/BPL. It's a shame. Likewise, the Nassau Airport Development Company has not found a formula to provide any returns to its shareholders in 10 years. The restructuring of the Bank of the Bahamas has cost the government over $200 million and counting. The government has invested close to $70 million in a company called NUCO, the operators of Alive.
We own Alive?
Why? Yeah, we own like 51%, I believe, in Alive.
I thought we're getting out of business.
Yeah, that's what I thought too. But we...
Who are the other owners?
I ain't getting into that. But I believe it's capable harm.
Public wants to know.
As can readily be appreciated, these subsidies, investments, and lack of return or dividends have a substantial impact on the government's fiscal resources. Given the need for prudence and restraint in the period ahead, it will therefore be imperative that such subsidies, investments, and other support from these state-owned enterprises be reviewed and assessed objectively and equitably in line with other areas of direct government program activity. They will therefore be folded into the program review exercise that I outlined earlier. In other words, just like we do with government agencies, we must, with these quasi-government agencies, review their operations to ensure that they are efficient and that they are providing a service to the Bahamian people that is necessary for subvention and that we are getting value for money. Yep. And you know, I can be honest with the Bahamian people. Unlike the previous government, who can tell you national health insurance can be free, I can tell you, there's no such thing as a free lunch. It doesn't exist. If I provide you a service over here for free, somebody over here got to pay for it. That is how it is. And so when we look at these government agencies, these government corporations, we have to objectively look at the structures to make sure that, one, they are efficient and they're operating according to best practices, and then we're going to have to figure out how do we pay for them. Because we can pay for them through direct fees to reimburse the cost, or we can pay for them by increased taxes. We're going to have to make a decision about that going forward. Because clearly, it is unacceptable and not sustainable the way that we've been going. Yep. It's just cold reality. As I've stated, business as usual is off the table. And we must find practical ways of doing government right, doing it better, and doing it affordably. Mr. Speaker, we have come to the view that the setting and implementation of fiscal policy in this country could be greatly enhanced if it were done within the framework of effective fiscal responsibility legislation. I thus indicated in the budget communication that the government intends to present such legislation for parliamentary approval. While the specific details of this law has yet to be nailed down, it is possible at this time to lay out its overriding objectives and general parameters. The overall focus of a fiscal responsibility law will be to elaborate on the rules and procedures relating to three core budget principles, namely accountability, transparency, and stability. At its most fundamental level, the law will affirm the foundational objectives of annual GFS budget balance and the maintenance of a government debt to GDP ratio at a level that is deemed to be desirable and sustainable. Given these stability objectives, the law would then mandate that the Minister of Finance must annually in the budget communication present for the coming budget year the 2 previous years as well as the 2 subsequent years. Details on the macroeconomic situation and forecast and the assumptions underpinning the budget forecast. Critically, the long-term fiscal targets that have been set in the formulation of the budget strategy. Information as to the fiscal outcomes for the 2 previous years, and an explanation of how and why those diverged from the previous targets that had been set. Fiscal targets for the coming and 2 subsequent years, and how these relate to the attainment of the long-run objectives. Details on the main fiscal components underlying the setting of the fiscal targets, i.e. recurrent and capital expenditure, recurrent and capital revenue, and debt redemption. In order to facilitate the attainment of fiscal objectives, the law could also require the setting of targets for some of the main components of recurrent expenditure, such as the government wage bill. If a GFS deficit is projected, an explanation of the fiscal measures included in the budget to move towards the elimination of that deficit and the time frame for that to occur. And I know Fort Charlotte has been particularly aggressive in respect to that. He wants to know how we can pay it. Good position, and I encourage him to continue to prod in that direction. As a means of strengthening the budget process and building consensus around fiscal targets and actions, consideration could be given to opening up the process of budget preparation with a series of consultations with the public and the private sector several months prior to the budget presentation. As well, it might be desirable to establish an economic advisory body that would operate independent of government and whose role would be to review and assess annually the government's fiscal performance during the previous year, as well as advise on appropriate fiscal targets for the coming year and beyond, including proposed actions in respect of expenditure and revenue. Again, this is an effort to be more inclusive, to give stakeholders, citizens, the opportunity to be more participatory in their governance. And that's what the people spoke about on May 10th. They wanted more of a voice. They wanted their voices to be heard. And we are committed to listening to that voice and including them in the decision-making as best we can. In order to tighten up budget implementation, the fiscal responsibility legislation could also include provisions requiring ministries and departments seeking to introduce new spending initiatives in year to identify requisite financing from within their existing budget allocations. Mr. Speaker, the budget communication indicated that we will be introducing amended public procurement regulations under the Financial Administration and Audit Act in order to increase the transparency and efficiency of the procurement process. A key feature of these new regulations is the establishment of a public procurement board comprising a chairperson appointed by the Minister of Finance from outside the public service who is competent and knowledgeable in public procurement. The Financial Secretary ex officio, a permanent secretary, and a minimum of 2 persons appointed by the Minister for nominations submitted by associations such as the Bahamas Chamber of Commerce and Employers Confederation, the Bahamas Institute of Chartered Accountants, the Bahamas Bar Association, and other private sector individuals who could contribute and be involved. Again, we want to broaden the participation of the private sector in our governance. And in doing so, instill a sense of accountability and transparency. Among its functions, the board will advise the minister on the regulations and monitoring of public procurement in the Bahamas, formulate and propose policy, legislative and regulatory actions for the better implementation of public procurement, including measures to facilitate the participation of small and medium-sized enterprises. That's important, Mr. Speaker. We want to make sure that small and medium-sized enterprises, who oftentimes do not have all of the resources to participate in government tendering processes, are supported and they're given an opportunity to at least qualify and to bid on portions of projects. It is our commitment to strengthening and helping to expand Bahamian business ownership and entrepreneurship. Because again, we realize the government can't do it all. And so we need to broaden that base and create a middle class that will be able to sustain us through the peaks and valleys of economic cycles and of foreign investment. This board will also provide advice and recommendations to the minister to ensure implementation by all parties of existing laws, policy, regulations, rules, and procedures governing the procurement of works, goods, and services, financed in whole or in part from public funds. The regulations set out the methods and procedures to be followed by procuring entities to ensure openness and equity. They also provide for the establishment of a procurement review tribunal that will adjudicate complaints and appeals in respect of the procurement process. Mr. Speaker, Article 136 of the Constitution establishes the office and functions of the Auditor General. However, experience reveals that the effectiveness of these functions has over the years been constrained by a variety of factors, including resource availability. It was therefore announced in the budget communication that the government will look at introducing legislation to strengthen the office of the Auditor General, as well as provide it with the resources needed to effectively and properly discharge its responsibilities as mandated by the Constitution. We also wish to preclude the possibility of undue government interference in the work of the Auditor General. One model under consideration could see the establishment of the Office of the Auditor General Agency, as would be under this as an approved authority whose overall work and finances would be under the supervision of a board comprised of members of Parliament and private citizens with requisite qualifications in accounting, law, or government. The board would play no role whatsoever in the preparation of the Auditor General's annual audit plan, nor in the conduct of individual audits. The Auditor General would publish his annual, basically what it's talking about is an audit committee. Take it out of the realm of politics. Establish an audit committee. The Auditor General would publish his annual audit plan within 30 days of the start of the fiscal year and would subsequently report on the result of his audit plan to Parliament within 60 days of the close of the fiscal year. It would be mandatory for reports to be sent to the Speaker without reference to the Minister of Finance. And Mr. Speaker, that is important because you might recall in the last term of Parliament, the Public Accounts Committee had cause to reference an Auditor General's report. And in my view, incorrectly, there was a ruling that the Public Accounts Committee could not access or refer to that audit report because it had not been tabled in the House. It is erroneous in my view. However, it was the government, it was in the government's authority at the time. And they did delay the presentation of that report so that it stymied the work of that Public Accounts Committee. We don't want that to ever happen again. That is the people's check on the government, as it is controlled by the opposition. And they should have unfettered access to any report that is issued by the Auditor General. They have that right. And so it's incumbent upon us, Mr. Speaker, that we must always be above board and willing to stand the full light of day in transparency in everything that we do. Because the side opposite, the opposition, has the ability, in fact, the constitutional right and responsibility to ensure that the government stays true and honest to the Bahamian people and judicious in the use of the resources that are provided to the government of the Bahamas. The Auditor General would also have the power to appoint external auditors to audit any agency or entity that is in receipt of public funds. Because that was another question that came up during that time, whether the Auditor General had the right to audit something they call the private account that Urban Renewal had established. Private account. Again, and there was another thing called the Urban Renewal Foundation, which they claim was independent of the government, but it received funds using the name of the government or influenced by the name of the government, and they were saying we had no right to investigate it. That can't happen. That can't happen. It was true. It was in fact the case
that the government, that the previous administration.
The member for Cat Island.
Thank you, Emmett.
You're raising on a point of order.
Point of order. It was never.
What is your point of order?
I'm presenting it. It was never the case that the previous administration, right, took the position that the accounts referred to by the member from East Grand Bahama, was not susceptible to the Auditor General's review. That was never the case. It was never the case. It was never the case. And in fact, at no time,
members, members.
At no time.
Members, please address the chair. We have a member on his feet.
At no time that I'm aware of that a request was made of the Urban Renewal Commission to review accounts. There are two accounts identified by him. He called it a private account. There's no such thing as a private account. Right? It was an account that was opened by the Ministry of Finance to be operated by the Urban Renewal Commission as set out by its mandate. And there was a foundation account. And at no time that I'm aware of that those accounts were asked to be looked at by the Auditor General. So it is not correct to say or to use the premise that something is untoward in the last previous administration that is informing the decision to strengthen, as it were, the Auditor General's role in the execution of his constitutional responsibility.
Just before the member for East Grand Bahama continue, just want to bring it to the attention of honorable members that when you rise on a point of order, it must be substantially a point of order and not just an attempt to frustrate or to debate a position when in fact you can do so in your response. The only 7 exceptions to interrupting a member while he is speaking. And so far I've been lenient because up to this point, none of the interruptions have fallen within the exceptions. And those exceptions can be found in Rule 30, subsection 27. So just be aware of the chair's discretion and leniency in that regard. The member for East Grand Bahama.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, Mr. Speaker, I don't want to relitigate the Urban Renewal Public Accounts Committee issue. But the member himself, who was in fact charged with urban renewal in the last administration, would, if he goes back to some of his own minutes that his initial is on, will know that the government referred to an account as the private bank account for urban renewal. It's in writing. You can go back there. Further, Mr. Speaker, it is a fact that it was disclosed that the Urban Renewal Foundation, I think it's called, or Bahamas Urban Renewal Foundation, I can't remember the exact name, was considered off limits to the Auditor General. In fact, the Auditor General, if you go back to the minutes of the last Public Accounts Committee, in one of the meetings suggested that he can, and he pointed to the constitutional law that permits him to look into that foundation account. And it was stated by government members that no, there's no government members on this foundation, that the funds are accepted from, go back and look at the minutes now. Mr. Speaker, the Auditor General will also have the power to appoint external auditors to audit any agency or entity that is in receipt of public funds. Mr. Speaker, many of the taxing statutes in the Bahamas have been outdated, have weak and outdated collection and enforcement provisions. Non-customs tax revenue flows from a handful of legislative vehicles, such as the Value-Added Tax Act, the Business License Act, the Property Tax Act, the Excise Act, the Excise Stamp Act, and the Stamp Act. These instruments have their genesis as early as 1925 in the case of the Stamp Act, and as recent as January 1, 2015 in the case of the Value-Added Tax Act. Commerce has become increasingly complex in recent decades, as have efforts to avoid or minimize the payment of taxes. Understandably, changes to legislation to respond to these changing environment have not always kept pace. The consequences of this misalignment is an erosion in the ability and consistency of tax authorities to protect government revenues and ensure greater tax compliance. Outdated and inconsistent enforcement and collections provisions threaten government's revenue and prejudice businesses that comply with their tax obligations. Modern jurisdictions worldwide have responded with legislative agendas that continuously strive to align enforcement and collection provisions with emerging and evolving avoidance practices. There is broad inconsistency in legislative tools available to enforce payment of a tax dollar owed to the government of the Bahamas. Because the taxing statutes were conceived individually, they reflect different enforcement and collection provisions, and perhaps provisions felt to be appropriate to the fiscal environment at the time they were enacted. For example, a dollar assessed under the recently implemented value-added tax legislation has a wide range of modern tools available to enforce payment, whereas the same dollar assessed under the Business License Act has very limited and cumbersome provisions to enforce payment. In order to remedy the situation, it was announced in the budget communication that the government will introduce revenue administration legislation to formally establish the Department of Inland Revenue. As well, this legislation will seek to improve and modernize the government's ability to protect and enforce the payment of amounts assessed under its tax statutes, thus providing a level playing field for tax-compliant businesses. To provide greater consistency and certainty to businesses in the way collections and enforcement is undertaken across all tax lines. To harmonize and streamline to the extent possible the procedural tools available to collect and enforce tax amounts under the various taxing statutes. To provide modern collection and enforcement measures as alternatives to outdated provisions in some of the taxing statutes. And to provide a consistent, non-discretionary rate of interest to all amounts owing to the government of the Bahamas under the various tax statutes. The government will review and assess alternative legislation options for the most effective way to achieve these important objectives in the period ahead and will table the preferred legislative package at the earliest convenience. Mr. Speaker, before I conclude, I would again like to thank the wonderful people of East Grand Bahama who have elected me with a clear mandate to lead our constituency's growth agenda. In this regard, I acknowledge the significant infrastructure works that are underway, which will be completed, and those to be initiated as resources become available. I also acknowledge the interests of many in working with this administration to restore our island and again signal that limited resources may hinder the pace of that engagement. But our effort is primarily to facilitate private sector growth, to alleviate the pressure off the public system. In the meantime, we will continue our social outreach, cultural, educational, and sponsorship programs to ensure that we catch as many of our citizens as possible and provide assistance while our agenda takes root. I would like to specifically thank my campaign team who worked hard and worked smart to ensure our victory. I will not name names, but you are all very dear to me, and you know who you are. And I will not forget where we came from, as the saying goes. Mr. Speaker, through my communication today to open this debate on the 2017-18 budget, I've made it abundantly clear that our government will not accept the status quo. We will not accept the status quo. The previous administration frittered away 5 years with false optimism and broken promises. In the process, wasting valuable public resources and leaving us with an unsustainable fiscal position. It is therefore imperative that we act now decisively to redress the public finances, eliminate the deficit as soon as possible, and return the government's debt load to lower, more appropriate levels. The days of talking a good game about fiscal consolidation are over. It is only through a sound fiscal strategy that we will be able to implement realistically and sustainably our bold and visionary agenda for growth, for jobs, and for prosperity. That agenda calls for transformation and changes that will create an open, productive, and competitive economy and society. To that end, government itself must embrace change and modernization if it is effectively to support growth and prosperity through efficient and sustainable programs and services. That means citizens, that means members, that we cannot be afraid to tackle some of these perennial programs and services that the government provides. We have to have faith in ourselves, in our people, that government does not have to, cannot do everything for everyone. Our resources just cannot continue to sustain it. And so I say to all of us, as the proverbial saying goes, tighten your belt. Tighten your belt. Those of us who might be a little bit more bigger than we should be, we have to lose some weight. It's part of the process. They're talking about me. Absolutely. But it's what it is. We're in a bad spot. And we're not going to get any better unless we make a dramatic and serious change in the way that we do business. And so I want to thank the officers, the staff of the Ministry of Finance in particular, who have put so much effort into preparing this budget. You know, when I walked in the door and they were having the budget meeting, the first thing I said to them is, I hope you all come to tell me you're cutting expenses by 10%. And they all laughed. And while we have not had the opportunity to work together long enough for me to let them know that I'm serious about that. Over the next year, you'll get to know each other. And we will get to know, as some people would know, I'm cheap. I'm very thrifty. And I intend to bring that mindset to government, to the Ministry of Finance. Again, I don't believe in living above your means. It is what it is. We know we get $10. We got to figure out how we can slice up $10. You know, it's like those families in the days gone by when you had one loaf of bread, and you got 14 children, and you got to figure out how you can slice up that loaf of bread to feed the 14. It ain't no different. It's the same thing. You got to set your priorities. You got to figure out what is important, what is critical, what is not going to if you cut it, what is not going to affect the growth and the job prospects in the economy. That's where that statistic-based, finance, numbers-driven decision-making has to come into play. But we're going to do this. I am optimistic that we're going to do this. And so, inasmuch as it is bad today, I am fully confident that better days are ahead for the Bahamas. Mr. Speaker, I look forward to the changes. I'm very optimistic about the future of our wonderful country. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I only want to say God bless the Commonwealth of the Bahamas, and God bless the wonderful people, citizens of this country who recognized that we were going in the wrong direction and had the courage and the strength and the wisdom to cause a turnaround for our country. God bless you.
Is there a second, though?
General, the member made some assertions about what will happen in the new legislation. I just wanted to clarify something with him and what happens now with the Auditor General's office.
Is this a point of order?
No, it's not. It comes under Rule, where is it? 32.6. Rule 32.6, which a member may speak more than once or to a question before the House, except an explanation, may not speak more than once, except an explanation, elucidation, reply, or with leave of the House. Hmm? Yeah, I'm asking for your leave. I'm speaking. It's not,
Leave granted.
Sorry?
Leave granted.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I just want to say, lest the impression is given that the Auditor General's office is some ancient institution that is that the Auditor General's office has already been strengthened, but I have no objection to further strengthening, but I just want to say it has been strengthened. The Ministry of Finance allows for has provided funding for the outsourcing of external auditors. Also, there is already an audit committee. I know that the member spoke about creating this. It already exists in the Ministry of Finance, and also the reports are sent directly to the House of Assembly. They're not put in the hands to the Speaker. They're sent to the Speaker, and that has been the practice since I've been in this Parliament. So I just want to ensure that we're not giving the impression that somehow the Auditor General has not been in a position to effectively do his job, and I think he has been. But I will not argue with the members seeking to further strengthen. But I just want to make sure that we understand we do have some structure at this point in our national development, 21st century.
I don't know that there's anything for me to really respond to.
No,
Save
just
that.
as a clarification.
Save that. I think the Auditor General has made several statements in respect to this. Additionally, the previous Speaker made an intervention with respect to this, as did the Public Accounts Committee make a intervention in respect to this. At the end of the day, I think the member for Angleton and I are on the same page in that we need to modernize, we need to enhance, and to ensure that the intent of the Auditor General's office is in fact strengthened, and he's given all of the tools that he requires in order to do the job on behalf of the Bahamian people.
Thank you. The chair recognizes the member for St. Barnabas.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to second the motion. First, Mr. Speaker, let me give thanks to Almighty God, who is the great architect of the universe, for giving me the breath and the opportunity to stand to my feet for the first time in this honorable House. Mr. Speaker, I rise as a servant for and on behalf of the people of the great constituency of St. Barnabas, namely the communities of Coconut Grove, Big Pond, Black Village, Rock Crusher, and the Oakfield area, Mr. Speaker. From the outset, Mr. Speaker, I beg your indulgence to convey my condolences to the family of the late Shirley Brown of Black Village, who was a giant of a woman and who's been a staple of the community of Black Village for decades. I pray that God continues to grant her family refuge, and may her soul rest in peace and rise in glory. Additionally, Mr. Speaker, in a gesture that I am confident will solicit the unanimous support of the honorable members, I extend congratulations to our Olympic champion, Shanae Miller-Weibo. On setting the world record for the 200-meter straight at the Adidas Boost Boston Games this past Sunday. She now has the distinction, Mr. Speaker, of being the first Bahamian female to hold an individual world record in an athletic event. Mr. Speaker, I thank you for your indulgence on those two matters. Mr. Speaker, I would be extremely negligent not relaying some sentiments on my initial rising as a first-time elected member of this honorable House. Mr. Speaker, I am humbled and honored for having my name permanently sewn into the fabric, the historical fabric, Mr. Speaker, of this honorable House, and pray to Almighty God that my deeds will bring honor to the selection that the people of St. Barnabas have made on May 10th. I pay homage to the honorable members that have illuminated the corridors of Bahamian history and represented the people I now serve. In particular, Mr. Speaker, I salute the great cultural icon, Renaissance man, and patriot, the Honorable Edmund Spencer Moxey, who served as a member of Parliament for Coconut Grove from 1967 to 1977, and was the visionary creator of Jumbe Village. Incidentally, Mr. Speaker, the Honorable Edmund Moxey would have left this honorable place a year after I was born. Mr. Speaker, progress and success are rarely singular efforts, so I would be justifiably accused of ungrateful and an egregious act if I did not in this moment express my gratitude to my parents who have lived long enough to see me elevated to this high plateau of service to the Bahamian people and the people of St. Barnabas. To my mother, Sharon Roll, my father, Don Cartwright, I am forever grateful for the love and encouragement and the values, Mr. Speaker, that they taught to me, the values of duty to God, to family, and to country. To the late Deacon Leviticus Hadley and the many teachers in the institution of St. Augustine's College, I thank them for imparting the lessons of diversity in academic excellence, athletic pride, and active citizenship. I thank the people of St. Barnabas for their confidence in allowing me to serve them. Mr. Speaker, it is in a surreal and singular moments like this that one cannot help but reflect on the journey to this point. For the past about 16 years, Mr. Speaker, on many occasions, I've sat deliberately in this public gallery to observe the proceedings of this honorable House. Admittedly, Mr. Speaker, wishing at times that I could insert myself into the debate. They say if you wait long enough, something will come. I must also admit, at times I was taken aback by the occasional trivial political jostling, Mr. Speaker, but I always left the gallery inspired by the promise and possibility of what these proceedings can do to bring meaningful transformation to the people of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. Why am I here, Mr. Speaker? Shirley Chisholm, who has the distinction of being the first African-American female to be elected to the United States Congress and the first African-American woman to run for the presidency, said that service is the rent we pay God for our space on earth. Mr. Speaker, I've come here to pay the rent. Also, Mr. Speaker, there will come a time when life's music will stop, and we will not be remembered for the distinctions before and after our names, but we will be remembered for what we have done to make things better in the Commonwealth of the Bahamas and make things better for the people of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. Mr. Speaker, I've consistently said in my political journey that I'm not here for what I can get, but for what I can give. This is not about me, Mr. Speaker. This is not about us. This is about the Bahamian people and the people of the great constituency of St. Barnabas. And Mr. Speaker, while I swear to uphold the Constitution of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas, I am equally resolute in upholding the moral constitution written in my heart, Mr. Speaker, by my Creator. I will do my best to be my best for the people of St. Barnabas. Mr. Speaker, I'm not offering this sentiment as a self-righteous one, but as a sincere one. You see, Mr. Speaker, like everyone here, I too love my country and I love the Bahamian people. The Bahamian people expect major change, Mr. Speaker, and they want us to resist the petty politics. So, Mr. Speaker, let the future of the Bahamas be determined by the bigness of our ideas and not the smallness of our politics. Now, Mr. Speaker, I am not naive about the political realities we face. However, I do believe that those realities have been created by us, just as the solutions to our country's most pressing problems resides within all of us. Mr. Speaker, I will not be perfect, but I promise the people of St. Barnabas that I will be perfect in my attempt in trying to make things better for them. After all, this is what they have sent me to Parliament to do. Mr. Speaker, we are in a defining moment in our nation's history, and I've often said and still submit, the Commonwealth of the Bahamas is the greatest nation on earth, and I regularly cite the premise on which I construct this belief. Look at the world-class people we produce within every discipline and the impact that they are having on the world stage, and we do it out of a mere population of 400,000 people. Our country is a tremendous incubator of intellect, purpose, and talent. So this unique Bahamian spirit, coupled with our duty and obligation to serve the people, will always lead us down the right path, Mr. Speaker. I'm of the belief that on election day, the Bahamian people always get it right. Mr. Speaker, we are not merely elected and re-elected as governments and individual members by the Bahamian people on our commitment to serve, but also our competence to execute. Not to oversimplify it, Mr. Speaker, but the terms on which we receive the support of the people is simple. Do the Bahamian people's business and do it transparently, justly, and competently. In no other area is that competence measured and weighed, Mr. Speaker, than in the stewardship of the Bahamian economy. This exercise today, Mr. Speaker, is less about a relitigation of the 2017 general election. Truth be told, Mr. Speaker, the Bahamian people made their judgment, the results of which is reflected in the makeup of this Honorable House today. The state of the Bahamian economy over the last 5 years, inclusive of double-digit unemployment, 4 downgrades, higher taxes on businesses and Bahamian citizens, and the redirection of $1.1 billion from its original destination in VAT money does not give way to any subjective perspective. It's an objective one, Mr. Speaker, not influenced by emotions, opinions, personal feelings, or political bias. It's a measurable one. So this budget, Mr. Speaker, represents the sobering reality that governments are, in fact, continuous. So you do inherit the bad decisions of your predecessors. Mr. Speaker, the first step towards our government delivering on its promised change agenda that seeks to put the power back in the hands of the people starts now. Mr. Speaker, our proclamation throughout the breadth of the country that it's the people's time reflects our government's unwavering commitment to support the aspirations of us all, for ourselves, our families, and our communities. The Bahamian people, particularly those in St. Barnabas, survived the torturous journey of the last 5 years, bruised by excessive taxation, debilitating mass unemployment, particularly among the youth of this country, thickets of neglect, a journey made worse by lack of transparency, accountability, and a deluge of unjustified spending. Mr. Speaker, I say without malice that we find ourselves nowhere near the destination promised by our predecessors. The strategic planning of governing the fiscal affairs of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas has fallen way short. Instead, Mr. Speaker, the previous government has in many ways taken the Bahamian people back in time. Mr. Speaker, hoisted on the back of the Bahamian people was a struggling economy with very little growth. But more than that, Mr. Speaker, behind the anemic, mismanaged economy are real-life consequences for Bahamians in general and the people of St. Barnabas in particular. Mr. Speaker, many of these economic indicators outlined in the budget communication reflect the larger story for the people of St. Barnabas trying to make their way. The mother on 2nd Street who is wary of the prospect of an uncertain educational future for her daughter. Mr. Speaker, the young men in Big Pond and Black Village who daily size up the possibilities of their dreams as they struggle with vexing unemployment. The widow on Hawthorne Street, Mr. Speaker, who is battling to make ends meet, being hampered with one form of income, and a small business owner in Rock Crusher, Mr. Speaker, who took the entrepreneurial leap, but whose business has been laden, Mr. Speaker, with crippling taxes. Mr. Speaker, in a few weeks, thousands of high school students will be searching for unemployment opportunities in the job market that has yet to satisfy the demands of high school graduates from last year. Through the grace of God, Mr. Speaker, the Bahamian people and the people of St. Barnabas have survived the last 5 years. And as with all good survival stories, Mr. Speaker, it is now our task to assess the damage, to account for what we have and what we need, and to chart our way forward with new leadership determined to lighten the load. Mr. Speaker, it has been tough by many metrics for Bahamians across the length and breadth of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. Mr. Speaker, through our government's change agenda, we have charted a clear path that will uplift and inspire and create an opportunity society. It is a path best traveled together as a community where we take care to ensure that every Bahamian is given the opportunity to contribute without being trampled upon or left behind. Mr. Speaker, this budget seeks to clear the brush, cut down the weeds, to expose the lay of the land and identify all obstacles and hazards that would slow us down in the years ahead. So far, Mr. Speaker, we've already seen how the previous government left hundreds of millions of unfunded commitments and have already imposed the largest tax increase in Bahamian history, which through their ineffective stewardship of the public purse had not been enough. As another sign of the previous government lack of proper fiscal administration, Mr. Speaker, we can look no further than to national health insurance. They were short on specifics and vague on implementation, Mr. Speaker. The lack of funding to operate the program was non-existent. And by their own admission, Mr. Speaker, as recent as April of this year, by the then Minister of Health, proclaimed there is no decision on how the government would fund the scheme. Mr. Speaker, I've had the opportunity to walk throughout the constituency of St. Barnabas, and I can only wonder and reflect, when so eager to make commitments, the prior government could not spare a morsel of the hundreds of millions of dollars to aid our neediest and our most vulnerable. How much would it have taken to ensure that families in any of our inner city communities could live in decent housing fit for the 21st century? How can it be that none of these hundreds of millions of unfunded commitments were even considered to ensure that more of those that live in the inner city, in the constituency of St. Barnabas, could have the dignity of living in government rented units free of major disrepair and exposure to the elements? Mr. Speaker, the government rental units through Bimini Avenue and 1st Street have needed major repair for a long time. And during my walks throughout the constituency, Mr. Speaker, my heart became full to see the conditions that some of our Bahamians are living in. How much, Mr. Speaker, of the hundreds of millions of dollars would have taken to bring much-needed relief to the Coconut Grove Clinic on Ackland Street that also houses the Coconut Grove Preschool? You know, Mr. Speaker, I had the opportunity to visit the clinic in Coconut Grove, and it has been there from the 70s. The original idea, through the efforts of the Honorable Edmund Moxie, was for it to be a community center. But now it houses a clinic. It isn't a polyclinic, so it doesn't provide all of the full services, but it's for maternal and child health. But the clinic is in major disrepair. Roof is leaking, and the staff at the clinic finds themselves on occasion having to move the emergency room from one side of the building to the next because they're dealing with a concrete roof, because initially the building should have gone 2 stories. Additionally, Mr. Speaker, even the sitting area, Mr. Speaker, the waiting area for patients, albeit there is a covering, Mr. Speaker, there is a covering, but expected mothers and children, thank you, expected mothers and children are exposed to the summer heat. Something must be done, and I will definitely have a conversation with Elizabeth, the Minister of Health. Most astonishing, Mr. Speaker, the area where the medications are kept, they have these yellow inventory cards basically indicating the medications that they need. 70%, Mr. Speaker, 70% of the medications are lacking in that facility. As recent as yesterday. Mr. Speaker, it is our fear that the hundreds of millions in unfunded commitments represents only the earliest and clearest of gruesome discoveries, that within the thicket there may lay hidden waste, fraud, and abuse. However, it is our government's intent not to allow such obstacles to prevent us from doing the people's work. We have a country to build, communities to strengthen, families to keep safe, and dreams to make possible. Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Member for East Grand Bahama has, in his budget communication, set the ground for what is to come. The people of St. Barnabas look forward, Mr. Speaker, to the time when our financial outlook is settled so that we can begin to engage fully the planned redevelopment and revitalization of the inner cities. And Mr. Speaker, I thank the Honorable Prime Minister for his vision of the redevelopment of the over-the-hill area. For far too long, the people in those areas, the Bahamian people in those areas, have been neglected. And as the Member of Parliament for St. Barnabas, and I'm sure the members for Bain and Grandstown and Centerville would agree with me when I say that it's about time that we bring the much-needed change to those areas. There's no doubt, Mr. Speaker, that the inner city communities can only truly thrive, Mr. Speaker, when they are fully integrated into the larger Bahamian economy. Yes. We cannot truly fulfill our greatness as a country, Mr. Speaker, allowing some to be left behind. We must carry all as we go on this journey. Mr. Speaker, increasing and strengthening the social security structure has its merits and its values, but it's only through the forging of the inner city communities into the national economy will small businesses flourish and real transformation happen. Mr. Speaker, transforming the inner cities will no doubt transform the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. Notwithstanding the constraints inherited from the previous administration, Mr. Speaker, the people of St. Barnabas are hopeful about the many life-changing proposals and policies planned by our government and outlined in our socio-economic growth agenda for the 21st century, including the commitment to make provision for potable water, sewer and sanitation services, and electricity throughout the inner city. Encourage the promotion of small, medium-sized businesses by providing them with incentives they need to survive. Create tax-free economic zones to encourage business growth and spur creation in the redevelopment phase and beyond. Encourage and empower absentee landowners to redevelop their ancestral lands and abandoned buildings. To establish, Mr. Speaker, multi-purpose community centers with amenities to provide supervised activities designed to promote and strengthen family and social cohesion for the youth and elderly. Enact legislation which allows duty-free concessions on all construction materials and building supplies used in the construction of business premises and new or refurbished owner-occupied homes. Mr. Speaker, the people of St. Barnabas were ready for the change. They believe that it is the people's time, and we will ensure that that happens for the people of the inner city, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, to be sure, we have before us a mammoth task. But if we are to start afresh and anew, it is first necessary to clear out all the debris, the ruins of failed policies and remnants of self-interest, to throw out the clutter, Mr. Speaker, so that the Bahamian people can see all that is left before us. We have a duty to our country and a duty to the Bahamian people to do so. Mr. Speaker, in closing, I wish to reference again, ever so slightly, the terms of engagement for which I am committed to in this honorable House. Mr. Speaker, our diverging political views will inevitably at times lead to passionate and spirited debates. I am, as every honorable member, a makeup of both personal trials and triumphs and vices and virtues, all of which we carry with us daily in one hand and the hopes and aspirations of our constituents in the other, Mr. Speaker. While our imperfections cannot be denied, what is also without challenges, Mr. Speaker, is that it will not be disagreements that will alter the decorum of this honorable House. It will be the tenor and spirit through which we convey those disagreements. So finally, Mr. Speaker, in that spirit, I submit that the Bahamian people have been through a tumultuous and uninspiring, Mr. Speaker, 5 years. But, Mr. Speaker, it's a new day, and good governance has returned to the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. We are here to restore hope and the faith that the Bahamian people have in their elected officials and the government that they elect. Mr. Speaker, I am grateful once again for being given the opportunity to stand on the floor of this House for the first time, as the Member of Parliament for St. Barnabas and all of the areas in which it represents. Mr. Speaker, may God continue to bless the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. May God continue to bless the people of St. Barnabas. And I thank you and the honorable members for their indulgence.
It has been moved and seconded that following bill has been read a second time and committed. A bill for an act for the appropriation of diverse sums of money for and towards defraying the expenses of the government of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas on the revenue account for the financial year commencing the 1st of July 2017 and ending the 30th of June 2018. As many? The chair recognizes the member for South Andrews.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, with your leave, sir, considering the hour and being close to the lunchtime, I would therefore beg your leave, as I was sitting for the member for Angleton, through you, the leader of government business, that we'll have the member for under adjournment, that the member for Angleton be our first speaker when we rejoin at 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock.
The chair recognizes the member for Bamboo Town.
Mr. Speaker, some habits die hard. But Mr. Speaker, I move that the business of the House do adjourn to 3 p.m. today, that the business of the House suspends to 3 p.m. today, Wednesday, June 7th, 2017.
Is there a second, though?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I got to do that, man. I got to save the side.
It has been moved and seconded that the House suspends its business until 3 p.m. As many as are in favor remain seated. Those who oppose shall rise. The House stands suspended, and the business of the House stands suspended until 3 p.m.